Post-Fontaine story quests well and truly drawing to a close, we are officially entering Genshin's endgame, and not only are the stakes raised, but we are finally learning more about not only the early years of Teyvat, but what to expect from Genshin's endgame. So stay tuned if you want to see a rundown on what the new Sovereign lore is, a quick refresh and updated analysis on Genshin's Gnostic inspiration, and if you just want to skip to the very end, a chart depicting which dragons are sovereigns, elementals, Conrian, or just unknown. Thank you for watching or listening, and let's dive into the Poisonous Vision. As always, our table of contents. Chapter 1. What has changed for the sovereigns and their reign? Chapter 2. We now know who the Demiurge is. Chapter 3. What are the gnoses? Chapter 4. Which Archons are in danger? Chapter 5. A recap on dragon classification. Chapter 6. A still shot of the completed dragon chart. Chapter 1. What has changed for the sovereigns and their reign? Genshin sovereigns have long been a mystery that fascinated lore deep divers, because they are clearly so integral to the foundation and formation of Teyvat, yet Mihoyo has been slow to release this information. Originally it was merely in books and one-off voice lines, then we got Apep as a boss and our entire quest dedicated to their lore. Now we have Neuvillette and a lot of questions have been answered. Let's start off simply. The sovereign's reign before Teyvat was Teyvat. Teyvat was only created when the Primordial One came down and defeated the sovereigns and then shaped Teyvat onto the world as he saw fit. I previously mentioned that it was hard to interpret where the sovereigns stood in all of this, because on the one hand they are described as terrifying, but the era when they reigned was referred to as when the doves held branches. So there was debate as to whether or not they were a terrifying evil that was vanquished, or were indeed peaceful and needlessly attacked by the Primordial One. I mentioned that one possibility could be that the sovereigns had created and lived in a world that suited them, but simply due to different natures would not have suited humans, hence why the Primordial One edited the world, and why humans describe them as terrifying. Well, Neuvillette has all but proved this now. Neuvillette is portrayed in an extraordinarily positive light by Mihoyo. Furthermore, he is very honest and open with the Traveler. I bring this up as one argument against the Sovereigns being good theory related back to the Archons. Now in Gnostic beliefs, which Mihoyo loves to pull from, Archons are, to put it shortly, the bad guys. Mihoyo giving them this role and then Ars Gotia demon names certainly raised many eyebrows, but these characters were fun, fan favorites, and certainly seemed to have their own gripes with Celestia, implying that this Gnostic retelling might not be so clear-cut. I bring this up for one main reason: many of the Archons are hiding things quite clearly. Neuvillette does not appear to be. Let's start with Venti. Venti on the surface seems very happy-go-lucky and even blasé with his reign, but when it comes to important facts, he is often tight-lipped. He can often play it off by quickly changing topics, but it is clear that as one of the original 7, he knows more than he lets on. For example, he brushes over why he and the Tsaritsa fell out, simply saying that they were close until 500 years ago. Now when we first hear that, we have yet to learn about Conria. Looking back, it's clear to see that that was what the event was. Furthermore, we know that besides I and Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, all Archons at the time were summoned to Conria. Makoto and in a sense Fossaleur unfortunately passed, leaving us little knowledge about the event. Venti and Zhongli, however, were both very much present. How active of a participant was Venti, especially given how much this carefree champion of freedom seems to regret and avoid the topic? Besides this event, Venti has a very interesting line in his character intro. He introduces himself as the best bard, who can play as any song past, present, or future, this being a direct nod to his namesake of Barbados, a demon who, amongst other attributes, can give summoners knowledge of the future. It seems to just be a nod to his namesake, but no other Archon fits their demonic counterpart as well as Venti. So was this simply an early plan to have the demonic names matter more that Mihoyo later scrapped? Or does Venti have far more power than he's letting on? Zhongli is obviously hiding a lot, and we will delve more into this come chapter 4, but he constantly hides behind contracts. Fitting for his role, but it does make it blatantly clear that he is hiding. Morx was also a victor in the Archon War, and Neuvillette calls him out specifically for it, implying that this was a great crime. In fact, Zhongli himself admits that it was an awful time and that he would not like to relive it or see a new Archon War begin. And regarding Conria, a nation sinking deep underground sounds exactly like his MO for dealing with dangerous entities. Though in fairness, besides a contract, I get the feeling if the Traveler were to straight up ask Zhongli more about Conria, he would give more details. Zhongli seems less like he has something to hide, and more like after the Archon War, the cataclysm that affected every other nation in Archon was just a Tuesday for him. Which actually leads to the point of if this massive cataclysm that killed off roughly 3 Archons scarred the others and led the Tsaritsa to begin her campaign against Celestia, if all of this is barely mentionable to someone who lived through the Archon Wars, how awful were the Archon Wars? Which we will get back to, but again, Neuvillette seems far more open than all the Archons. I talked at length on Venti and Zhongli as they are the oldest and would have the most experience with the Archon Wars in early Celestia. but even Ai seems tight-lipped, though mostly just because in general, she's not the most talkative of individuals. We are blatantly shown that Mahito will do anything for knowledge, even trade off 2 gnoses. This knowledge never being revealed to us as the traveler. Even Fauchelevent concocted a grand master plan to evade the plans of Celestia, which, while clear enough it was to prevent the flood from killing everyone, it also does not fully reveal how evil Celestia is. So on the whole, Neuvillette straight up confessing to his status, struggles, and plans to seek justice from the Archons places him in a very different place for Genshin's endgame than the rest of the Archons. Now that being said, Genshin has already made this a huge 180 plot twist, that being that these sovereigns are not that evil. Hints were given, but very early game did seem to hint that it was fairly black and white. So let's finally look at exactly what Neuvillette reveals, now that we know we can trust him. Neuvillette obviously fulfills the Hydra Dragon prophecy, as I discussed in my previous dragon video. He does confirm what Mihoyo has repeatedly shown us, which is dragons can take on any form. We have dragon-shaped creatures that are just elemental beings, and now sovereigns stuck in human form. Now back to the concept of the pre-primordial world being better suited to sovereigns but inhospitable to humans. Neuvillette is pure hydro, as evidenced by his faster swimming, mastery of the element, and only consuming water. To Neuvillette, water is a delicacy and easily identifiable. He even says he only likes foods that are close to water, like a very thin soup. Now it is a funny laugh, but when coupled with his self-proclaimed inability to understand the complexities of human emotions, it is clear to see why a sovereign-controlled world would be impossible for humans to live on. Imagine a being giving you only water to drink and no food. You wouldn't last very long. And this probably went for all of the sovereigns. Child laughs that his brother Anton thinks the people of Liyue eat rocks. But when it comes to the sovereigns, that might have very well been the case. Which could explain at least partially why a world suited to them would be inhospitable to humans, but also why humans may have been frightened of them. In fairness, there may still be more to the terrifying aspect. After all, Neuvillette himself admits that had he not spent 500 years among humans, he may have never learned how to live among them or to cherish them. And Apep is hell-bent on seeking the destruction of humans, so perhaps when the Primordial One first arrived and introduced the humans, there was animosity between the two groups. But most likely less in the sovereigns are inherently evil way, and more in a they're an other who is trying to kick us out of our world. And speaking of, the sovereigns still have a grudge against the Primordial One. As Neuvillette states, his grievances with the usurpers have yet to be settled. They owe a debt of blood that shall not be forgotten. Usurper being a term often used by the sovereigns for the Primordial One. Interestingly enough, Neuvillette hints that the Primordial One, the Heavenly Principles, and Celestia may all be one and the same. Now, the Heavenly Principles being all or part of Celestia has been mentioned before. Neuvillette confirms this by saying that Fauchelevent sought to deceive the Heavenly Principles, even though before it was said to have been Celestia. So we have it well established that Celestia and the Heavenly Principles can be referred to interchangeably. Perhaps there's only the Heavenly Principles in Celestia, or perhaps the Heavenly Principles is the leader or decision-maker. But here's where things get a little more intense. Neuvillette's final ascension line reads, "My final destiny is to judge the usurper king in the heavens above. But until that time comes, I will lend my power to you." Now, as mentioned before, usurper has been used for both the Primordial One and the Archons. This being the usurper king, it is safe to say that the implication is that it is the Primordial One. The heavens above, however, sounds like one of two possibilities. The first being Celestia. As I mentioned before, this could mean that the Primordial One is the Heavenly Principles. After all, the Heavenly Principles is also referred to as the First Ascender, which, given the way the Primordial One was said to have come down and conquered Pre-Teyvat, it would make sense, but again, this is not fully confirmed. Another possibility is that the Primordial King left once more to that world outside of Teyvat. After all, the Gnostic belief is that the Earth is a false world created within an already present universe. We know Teyvat is likely something similar, as the Fatui have repeatedly remarked that the stars are fake, hinting that Teyvat may not be as real as we deem our Earth to be. So perhaps the Primordial One went back to that outside world, but it is the first time we would be hearing it referred to as above rather than below or outside. But going off of the concept of Teyvat being a limited space, perhaps it is a smaller portion of what the sovereigns once ruled. Neuvillette's voice lines state that this realm dismantled was of the formidable father himself, but what now reigns here is a cluster of filthy feathers. Though we live in a world of disarray, I shall undertake to restore all that has been broken. Cluster of filthy feathers is certainly minimal and derogatory language. This might be related to the splendor of a purely elemental world, or it could hint at the size and authenticity. But this quote is weird for a few reasons. Firstly, that it's a quotation within a voice line, which is odd as it should just automatically be a voice line. Who exactly is Neuvillette quoting? Furthermore, the language of formidable father likely refers to the Dragon King who ruled over the sovereigns. The language used does resemble the language used when discussing the Christian God. Again, the Gnostics believed that Earth was formed by an evil entity and that there were true gods beyond the Earth. We know that the Nibelung, or Dragon King, ventured into the abyss and came back with powers it used to try and defeat the Primordial One. So perhaps the Dragon King was supposed to be closer to a true Christian god. After all, while most of Genshin utilizes Gnostic interpretations of Christian lore, Fontaine was the first to reference biblical lore specifically. Nivelette is a clear reference to the Leviathan, with many of his lines likening back to biblical sayings, and his character intro being titled, "He who looks down on all that are haughty," a direct quote from Job 41:34. Given that the Fontaine flood directly paralleled Noah's Ark and the Sovereign Era was titled "When the Doves Held Branches," Mihoyo may blatantly be saying that those characters that align with actual Judeo-Christian lore are good, while the more Gnostically aligned are bad. Which brings us directly to Chapter 2. We now know who the Demiurge is. As I mentioned before, if the sovereigns are all that is biblical and good, then anything Gnostic-related would be bad. Now a quick rundown for those who have missed or would like a Gnostic recap. The Gnostics believed that there were many good gods who lived in Pleroma, their version of heaven. Each existed as a Syzygy pair, a male for every female and vice versa, but one goddess, Sophia, broke the natural order and created an offspring purely from herself. Because it was not born of a Syzygy pair, it was dark and twisted and evil. This was the Demiurge, a great serpent-like beast. Ashamed at her failure, she cast the Demiurge into the darkest parts of the universe in an attempt to hide it from the other gods, where it then created the Earth. But the Demiurge longed for attention and companionship, so it created the Archons, the Greek word for ruler, and these rulers serve the Demiurge by lording over their domains. They are almost all described as beings of pure evil. Eventually, with the help of the Archons, the Demiurge creates humans, but in their creation is tricked by the deities of Pleroma, and humans are created with the spirit of Pleroma, meaning they are the only good beings on Earth. But all hope is not lost, as humans can escape Earth and ascend into Pleroma. In fact, descenders can come down from Pleroma and help guide humans. Jesus was one of them. The only thing you need to escape is gnosis, or the Greek word for knowledge. So that was a very, very quick summary of Gnostic beliefs, but importantly, the Demiurge and the Archons are evil and seek to torture humanity. It is quite clear that Genshin draws a lot from the rest of these myths as well, but up till now, the role of the Demiurge and Archon was hard to pinpoint. While Archons could mean the Archon gods of Teyvat, it was hard to call them pure evil. I mean, going into the Gnostic legends, they are heinous, genuinely awful individuals. I'm talking about myths that need content warnings before they can be said on social media. So it did not seem right to attribute them to our lovable yet flawed Genshin Archons. After all, though misguided and mysterious, none seemed truly evil, especially as Genshin mentioned the time of the Sovereigns before the Primordial One as a world not fit for humans. And the Primordial One is often described as a descender, though not confirmed as one. The Heavenly Principles was a known descender, and again closely tied to Celestia. Descenders in Gnosticism were the good guys, the ones sent by Pleroma to save humanity. Again, while Gnostics said that the Old Testament God was the Demiurge and therefore evil, they worshipped Jesus Christ as good and believed him to be a descender. So if the Primordial One and/or Heavenly Principles descended and the Sovereigns made things difficult for humans, perhaps the Sovereigns were meant to be the Gnostic Archons instead. But as I mentioned last chapter, this is likely not the case. Instead, it appears as though Mihoyo is drawing both from Gnosticism and more mainstream Judeo-Christian beliefs, and setting up a distinction between the two. So with that being said, it seems stupid at this point to argue that the Archons are the good guys. After all, they are literally called Archons, and they are named after demons. And the most truthful, all-powerful character we have met so far has declared them as having to face justice. Sadly, our lovable Archons are most likely the bad guys. Now that being said, I do think Genshin is spinning this a little. After all, they know how much fanfiction and waifus are drawing in their player base, and likewise they know that the players are what is keeping the gacha and merch cash cows running. That being said, Mihoyo is always very careful about alienating their player base. We have yet to see a playable character die, just look at Child's story. This previous Archon quest had fans panic that his death flags were all about to trigger, but both Skirk and Arlecchino made sure to inform the player that Child is still alive, just recovering. Now likewise, the Archons as a whole are probably the most loved group of characters. Again, there are 5, so it's steep competition. So it would be very out of character for Mihoyo to pull a haha, they were evil this whole time and you totally fell for it. Again, I'm not saying 100% that that won't happen. After all, once Genshin Impact ends, there go the profit margins, but I still think Mihoyo will redeem them in some capacity, if only to keep fans coming to their other games and keep merch sales going. So what could happen with the Archons? We'll discuss them individually later on, but let's look at the group as a whole. I have mentioned that the Tsaritsa is aiming to destroy Celestia and escape Teyvat. After all, in order to escape Earth, you need to gather gnosis. Perhaps to escape Teyvat, you need to gather gnoses. Likewise, Celestia repeatedly is described antagonistically, so let's deep dive this a little. We have seen talk of the celestial nails and the devastation Celestia is capable of. Dragonspine is now covered in permafrost. Why is still unknown, as Salvindignir was once blessed by Celestia until Celestia destroyed it. Lewis Chasm was formed by a celestial nail, perhaps as found in the Flower of Paradise Lost weapon description. This explains it. And though the invaders brought war to my former kin, they also brought about illusions that could break through the shackles to the land. But the Master of the Heavens, consumed by fear for the rising tide of delusion and breakthroughs, sent down the divine nails to mend the land, laying waste to the mortal realm. We then suffered the torment of exile. Stripped was our connection to heaven, to our powers of enlightenment. Which not only sounds like Celestia or the Master of the Heavens was wary about humans gaining too much power, but also has two other possible connections. The first being that stripping them of enlightenment stripped them of their connection to heaven. Again, a direct connection to Gnostic beliefs that enlightenment was the way to seek entrance into heaven. But secondly, it means delusions. Delusions in Genshin being a weighted term, as it refers to the false elemental powers granted to the Fatui, and does echo what the Tsaritsa is accomplishing today, seeking outside knowledge to create delusions and breakthroughs. In this case, breakthroughs could literally mean breaking through Teyvat's containment, and it would be interesting if what here is called heaven could be what is now referred to as the Abyss. After all, it has been claimed that delusions harness power from the Abyss, hence why they are dangerous for human use. Now, the Goddess of Flowers does explain a little bit more about the celestial nails, but let's discuss the other nails first. Tsurumi Island likely had a nail implanted in it, causing it to be enshrouded in fog, though the nail is now missing. The deity that witnessed at the Thunderbird stated that they could have dismissed the fog if they had wished, which is the first time an entity has said so. Lastly, it is said that the Desert of Sumeru, or at least the part covering King Deshret's former kingdom, was formed as a direct result to the usage of forbidden knowledge, which leads to the final warning the Lord of Flowers left King Deshret about the nails. Since the disaster, I have long been cursed to never again look upon the heavens. It is my fortune that I have been able to maintain myself till now, but my home calls to me nigh constantly, even as a disaster between the stars and the abyss grows ever emergent on the surface of the crystals. Heed my warnings, seek not the master of the four shades, and inquire not of the mysteries of the sky and the abyss. Otherwise, as shown by the nail of retribution, certain calamity and sorrow shall follow. Now, the Master of the Four Shades is the primordial one, and again they are drawing a comparison to the heavens and the previously mentioned Master of the Heavens. So the primordial one could have even more of a connection to Celestia. But most importantly, the Lord of Flowers speaks to the sky and the abyss as one, but that they are against the stars, which, as Genshin has acknowledged, the stars are fake. So could this again harken back to the Tsaritsa's usage of the abyss and Celestia's unexplained hatred of it? So to recap, we know Celestia sends down divine nails of mass destruction, possibly as an attempt to destroy any outside knowledge from existing. We know Celestia is the one who set off the Archon War by creating and gifting the gnoses. It is believed that Celestia played a major part in the fall of Conria, again for reasons very similar to why the divine nails are repeatedly sent down. And now Fossolor deliberately hid from them, as to not do so would have led to the deaths of thousands, again, possibly by divine nail. And Neuvillette likewise nearly declares war on them, judgment and fairness, but a judgment of blood. So to return to the question of what Mihoyo may be doing with our Archons, let's look at how that relates back to evil Celestia. We know Venti seems to chafe at the bit when it comes to Celestia. He hardly wants to follow the rule he was set, preferring others to have freedom. Not to mention every other Archon has handed away their gnosis. So these little things that were enough to kickstart what is likely the worst non-sovereign war Teyvat ever had, but now they simply don't matter. We will of course discuss where they came from next chapter, but let's focus on what rejecting them means right now, which is to say rejecting Celestia. Time and time again, the Archons appear to be rejecting Celestia, admitting their faults and seeking to live better lives, and for 4 out of 5, more human lives. 3 literally giving up ruling altogether. So perhaps this is the spin Mihoyo will take. After all, the oldest of the 2 are our most mysterious, and the eldest the most blatantly so. The eldest, Zhongli, being the only one to have fought to gain the gnosis when the challenge was set forth by Celestia. Most of the others inherited the position, or in Venti's case, overthrew a tyrant, something he would have done, gnosis or not. So it would make sense to have the true evil of Celestia be revealed not only to the traveler and the common folk, but also in some capacity to the Archons as well. In this way, Mihoyo can leave them as evil, or at least complicit/supportive of evil, while giving them a bit of a redemption arc. And that unknowing villain-turned-hero aspect could further enamor Mihoyo to their fans. In terms of Zhongli, we will look more at his case in Chapter 4, but to put it simply, he already has a redemption arc. He went from a battle-hungry war god to one who protected and raised his people. So now that we covered Celestia and the Archons in brief, who is this Demiurge I keep teasing? Well, probably the primordial one. I said last chapter that there was enough evidence to propose calling the heavenly principles the primordial one and vice versa. Again, not enough to definitively confirm this, but enough that it implies that the primordial one is at the very least somehow tied to Celestia, especially with the Lord of Flowers equating the Master of the Four Shades with the Master of Heavens. So, if Celestia is our true big bad, after all they are nameless, faceless, and we learned about the nails fairly early on, Mihoyo has much less to risk by declaring them an evil entity. Suffice to say the fans will not riot en masse over it. And if Celestia is the big bad and the primordial one is directly tied to Celestia, then the primordial one is the big bad. Which actually makes a lot of sense when looking at the Demiurge. The Demiurge created a false world. We know Teyvat was created by the primordial one. The stars are fake, perhaps referring to the fact that Teyvat is in some sort of capsule system and not the whole or real world. Nivelette refers to it as merely dirty feathers, further indicating that it is not a wonderful creation and seen as lesser by the sovereigns. In Gnostic lore, the reason there was so much suffering on Earth was that it had been created by a flawed being and would therefore always be flawed in turn. Now, these two are out of order, but both are true in Gnosticism and Genshin. The Demiurge made the Archons and then humans. The primordial one first made humans. But if the primordial one and Celestia are tied together, then the primordial one also made the Archons. The humans are the only good on Earth. Nivelette has said that he would hurt no common folk in his quest to judge the Archons. The Archons of Gnosticism, however, are just as flawed and guilty as the Demiurge. In point of fact, the Archons of Genshin are an excellent example of flawed beings creating flawed systems. We run across a major theme in every nation of Teyvat, and this often relates back to the ideals set by their Archon, which are then often dismantled by the Traveler being a dissenter and therefore, as mentioned, a force for good. In Mondstadt, we see how freedom leaves the people of Mondstadt scrambling to defend themselves. Not only have they put a military force into place as their ruling body, they also still rely on their Archon to save them from the threat of Dvalin. Perhaps they could have fought him off, but with most of the military out of the city, it is likely Mondstadt would have faced severe destruction if Venti had not woken up in time. Indeed, Venti himself says, "What is freedom if demanded of you by a god?" Liwa has a rather Tolkien-like spin of the elves are leaving. Liwa's question is what happens when traditions and customs are forced to change. The god of contracts and stone saw everything as long-lasting and unbreakable, which leads to much scrambling when things finally change. And speaking of change, we get the first of the easily identified as flawed realms in Inazuma, the Land of Eternity. In her attempt to not face any more change after the death of her sister, Ai set forth decrees to preserve Inazuma in as close to stasis as she could, banning foreigners, letting others rule rather than face her trauma, and this rule leading to the Vision Hunt Decree and Fatui machinations taking over the land. Greater Lord Rukkhadevata promoted wisdom, and her people failed to learn what it truly meant to be wise, so when her successor appeared and did not immediately have all the answers, they imprisoned her and tried to take matters into their own hands. Fossolor wanted to play at being a human, and play she did till it consumed her. Her life was a torturous monotony of the grandiose, and justice was warped into a spectacle rather than a boon. And that very concept of a flawed being creating a flawed world is exactly what Gnosticism means with the Demiurge. If Mihoyo has given us this with every Archon, imagine how flawed Teyvat is to have been created by the Demiurge primordial one. And on that note, Chapter 3. What are the gnoses? Okay, I know I keep talking about the Archons, but bear with me a little longer as we discuss the new knowledge of the gnoses. As Paimon mentioned, she thought they were just chess pieces, which, to be fair, was how the fandom perceived them, very powerful and important chess pieces, but chess pieces, something Celestia simply created one day and that was that. But, no, they are most certainly not. So 4.0 to 4.3 is our dark Genshin era, which is quite concerning as this might mean 5, 6, and 7 are going to be even more so. Speaking of, trigger warning on quite a few dark themes, there'll be a timecode on screen for a second here to skip past the dark aspects, and I'll recite the specific triggers in a few seconds more. Abortion, mass murder, abuse, both physical and psychological, and dismemberment. Let's start simply, and I'm not making any statements about this, just stating it as a very adult turn for Genshin to take, as I'm sure many of you know quite young children who have been allowed to play Genshin Impact. As of 4.3, Roses and Muskets, the world of Teyvat officially has abortion. Roses and Muskets gave us a delightful tale of mystery and suspense, but I will leave 2 quotes from the character of Morris here. I also didn't expect Elisa to insist on bringing the pregnancy to term, and I gave her a large sum of mora, told her to leave the family and get rid of the baby. Now this may seem weird to point out. But there is a joke in fiction communities, especially fantasy and sci-fi ones, that if it doesn't happen on screen or in-universe, it does not exist. Bathrooms are a common one mentioned. As for polite society, bathrooms can be frequently glossed over. In fact, prior to Fontaine, and more specifically the Fortress of Meripede, we technically had no confirmation that Teyvat had plumbing. So prior to this, it could be assumed that abortion was up in the air and up to player interpretation. Now it is confirmed, again not taking a stance either way, simply saying this is decidedly adult. Which yes, we have had dark/adult elements to Genshin before, but mostly hidden deep in lore books. Even Scaramouche's entire backstory is told to us as a cartoon. So this is merely to point out that Mihoyo is starting to embrace openly more adult themes, and as this is the tip of the iceberg, the two to follow are decidedly dark. We saw all of Fontaine drown. Like, they came back in the end, but we discuss a large portion of Poisson dying, and then transition into all of Fontaine nearly doing the same, this being after we attempt to literally execute Farina. So again, darker themes are definitely coming into play and being told in an adult way. Even the cannibal suspicion in the prison was played off for laughs, but in the versions that follow, things are decidedly more dark. Likewise, Wriothesley's character story was also quite dark. Fear like that is debilitating on the human brain. I won't go into details, but there is a scene that can literally be read as a victim attempting to report her abuser to the proper authorities, only to have her abuser appear right behind her, forcing her to be unable to voice her concerns and face immediate punishment at the hands of her abuser for attempting to report him. Again, for some, it may not have read as that serious, but for an adult audience, especially anyone who has lived through or been trained to spot abuse, it can read as a very intense scene. Which ultimately leads to what the gnoses are: cut up human body parts, specifically of the third descender. Funnily enough, this is the one time Mihoyo actually acknowledges that this is a rather dark topic, as Paimon squirms at it and cries out that because it was a descender, it was too horrible to think of the same fate befalling the traveler. Which is true, it is the first time we have been threatened with possible dismemberment. And again, it may seem odd that I'm harping on these dark themes, but keep in mind, Genshin doesn't have corpses. Entities die in sparkle clouds and/or loot drops. So while Genshin has talked about death and hunting food and whatnot, it never really went into the details about the process. Now, dismemberment's on the table. So the gnoses are body parts. This was revealed by Skirk to Neuvillette, who then conveys it to the Traveler, which to begin with is odd, as they very clearly resemble chess pieces. So how exactly does this work? Because I can see one of three options here. The first being that the third descender was some sort of magical chess set, or at the very least these are components of their physical form that were in the exact same shape while they were united in their form, which then leads to the question of what their form actually looked like. In fairness, I do think this is the least likely of the three possibilities. The other two make more sense to me. One being that the gnoses were carved. This is marginally less dark than it sounds. After all, we have entities like the hypostases, who's to say the third descender didn't resemble them, and that sort of block form does seem like it could have been easily carved into chess pieces. The last option is that they are not the actual body parts, in terms of looks that is. After all, our traveler is very humanoid. It is very possible that the third descender was too. So perhaps the actual pieces were morphed into chess pieces that we know by some sort of primordial one magic. Or lastly, but kind of connected to the previous theory, they are simply containers that hold the essence or parts of the third descender. As I said, I will combine these last two guesses into one, as they do fall in the same vein of being altered to become gnoses. To be honest, while there is a fascination as to why the gnoses look like chess pieces, after all it does lead to the follow-up question of how they were created, I think one of the biggest questions is what does this mean for our traveler? After all, we run into an interesting conclusion. Neuvillette refers to them as authority, equating them in some capacity to forms of his power. We will discuss this more in a minute, but for now let's focus on the fact that if the gnoses did fully come from the sovereigns, then each sovereign gave up a gnosis, not exactly willingly, but each gnosis comes from one of these core elemental beings of pre-Teyvat, animo for animo, hydro for hydro, so on and so forth. But if they are mentioned as being all from the third descender, then it is safe to conclude that the third descender in some capacity had access to or some sort of synergy with each of the 7 elements of Teyvat, which sounds exactly like our traveler. But let's look at one other aspect first. I just mentioned that Neuvillette sees them as authority, that being the direct term he uses. He defines it as absolute control over an element. But in Act 4, Chapter 4, Neuvillette says that the first usurper, the primordial one, seized part of the dragon's powers, and that stolen power is the basis for the gnoses. So how do these two explanations coincide? On the one part, the gnoses are parts of the dismembered third descender. On the other hand, they are created with a stolen power from the sovereigns. But perhaps this does make some sense. Let's backtrack a little and set up a timeline. Nivelette mentions that this power theft happens when the first usurper first descended. So the first descender / primordial one steals the elemental authority from the sovereigns. We then have a second descender, who may or may not have been the heavenly principles. We then have a third descender. The third descender's remains somehow become the gnoses. Celestia offers up the gnoses, kickstarting the Archon War, and with it the reign of the Archons. Essentially, our missing piece is somehow the 7 separate elemental authorities need to combine with the third descender. I see 2 possibilities. As I mentioned before, the gnoses could be formed magically with the remains of the third descender. In this way, both the sovereign authority and the descender remains would have been combined to form the gnoses, possibly after death. Or it could be very similar to what is currently happening with our Traveler. After all, Paimon, our in-game voice for Mihoyo, immediately draws the comparison between the third descender and the fourth descender, aka our Traveler. We know that our Traveler gains their new elemental abilities by interacting with the Archon statues. Now, during our first Tartaglia battle, when the Traveler first uses Animo and Geo simultaneously, there is an option to state that we, the Traveler, are slowly regaining our previous power, which is a little complicated because it is certainly hinted at that after our fight with the unknown god, we lost a significant amount of power. But this might not be the elemental power Teyvat knows. If we look at the intro scene for Genshin Impact, we can clearly see that the twins are not using any of the 7 elements that we know. Some have called this a light element, but it is never actually specified or explained. So it is very possible that the Archon statues are not unlocking a power the Traveler already has, but rather bestowing elements for the first time onto the Traveler. So backtracking again, the Archon statues in some capacity are connected to their Archons. They might also be united with Celestia somewhat, but at the very least they are tied to the gnoses, which, as we have established, contains some version of the Sovereign's elemental powers. So when the Traveler comes into contact with remnants of the Sovereign's powers, they are then able to use the Sovereign's powers for themselves. This could have been the exact case with the third descender. When exposed to the Sovereign's authority, they absorbed it somehow. The question is, did they just mimic it, as it seems our Traveler does, or did they actually fully or partially absorb them? And if they absorbed it, is our Traveler doing the same? So that would be the extent of what we can currently conclude about the gnoses. We are mostly operating on theories and deductions, and we don't even have enough to speculate on why the third descender is dead and how that occurred. We do have 2 more oddities to speculate on. The first is that Tartaglia refers to the gnoses as stars when writing to his sister. Now we know the Fatui claim the stars are fake, so this could be connected. But he also plays fantasy with his siblings a lot, so this may be a poetic rendition of his mission. The other oddity is when Nivelette hands off the gnosis, he says he does not need its power. So it aided him in restoring power somehow, but is now useless to him. So is it that the Hydrognosis is severely weakened and drained now, or does it act more like a jumpstart? If we do figure that out, we may be able to guess how the Tsaritsa is going to use them against Celestia. Speaking of, it is interesting to think of the fact that technically Fontaine owes Snezhnaya. This is their first diplomatic mission that ended well. For the Fatui cover of diplomacy, this is actually a win. They were so close with Dottore and Sumeru until the old academia got overthrown. But to Fontaine, the Knave and Tartaglia are heroes, which, to go on a pure side tangent that just greatly amuses me, imagine the other nations learning about this in the Steambird, especially Liyue. Because to every other nation, the Fatui are the bad guys. Not a single nation has not been negatively affected as a direct result of the Fatui's actions. So the Knave being a hero is shocking enough. But imagine poor Liyue reading about Child, because they knew him for a period of time prior to him unleashing Osile. How long is not exactly clear, but at the very least the shopkeepers and restaurant owners like him for how he spent his mora. In fact, while met with suspicion because of being a Fatus, it does not appear as though he was fully hated. Perhaps he even had friends. Then he pulls a villain card and attempts to drown the entire harbor. Which, fair enough, he claims it never would have happened, as it was just supposed to be a lure, but that's still a very large PR failing. Now imagine reading in the Steambird that this rich diplomat-turned-terrorist just saved Fontaine by fighting off a fierce sea monster. I mean, they have to be asking, are you sure he was fighting and not summoning the sea monster? And then if they do believe the Fontanians, are they now questioning if he was trying to fight Osile and things just got a little out of hand? Anyway, that's a complete tangent that just amuses me. But if there is any takeaway here, it is that Snezhnaya may have one ally now. After all, Nivelette did not seem phased to hand off the Gnosis as he does not need it. And while we do have no voice line of him describing her, perhaps he approves of what the Tsaritsa is doing, or at least does not see it as something worth seeking justice over. So we shall have to see if the trend continues come Natlan. Now, Fontaine is the first of our 7 nations to reject Celestia's authority fully and revert to the original natural order of Tevat, and have the sovereigns as the elemental authority. And Nivelette states that he will judge all the Archons accordingly for their crimes against the sovereigns. I've been teasing it for a while, so let's discuss the 7 and what could be the fate Nivelette, and by extension Mihoyo, plans for them. Chapter 4. Which Archons are in danger? Let's go in order of when we met them and start with Venti. I've already discussed this a little, but essentially Barbatos is reluctantly an Archon. He chafes against Celestia and would love for Mondstadt to be fully independent. In fact, he seems to live a life as close to a normal wind spirit as he can, but I also mentioned that he knows a lot more than he lets on. After all, he is the 2nd oldest and the 1st Animo Archon. He is a victor of the Archon War, even if it was by overthrowing a tyrant. He also hints that, like his demonic namesake, he can see the future. Barbatos has a lot more to reveal, and Nivelette seems to think the same, as he calls him the god of breeze and hope, and appears confused at the fact that he goes around as a drunkard. He finalizes his voice line with saying that he will meet him himself and proceed from there. So again, it is not likely that Mihoyo will fully come out saying that all the Archons are 100% evil, but I think much like we just saw with Farina and Fossadar, many Archons will be revealed to be hiding things and knowing far more than they are letting on. So Venti will likely have some major reveals for us as things come down to the wire, but he probably will be safe. Speaking of secrets, let's talk about Zhongli. It's no secret that this man has hundreds of secrets. He's not only our oldest living Archon, but one of the oldest living beings in Tevat, with only Apep and Age-Daha known to be older. So clearly he's a man who would know a lot about Tevat's history. And he has hinted multiple times that he knows things he cannot reveal due to contracts. We do not know what he traded the Gnosis for, especially after slaughtering countless rivals to win it in the first place. Ai says that she doesn't believe his story is anywhere near finished in her voice lines. I've also mentioned that we don't actually know how Moryx came to be. He mentions his age with this line, "I've dwelt upon this world for more than 6,000 years." Which is a very odd way to phrase it. Again, this could just be an attempt at keeping character with the persona of a wise old god, but many do speculate that he may be older than he seems. After all, we've already said that Tevat was not the world the sovereigns reigned over. It was the world the primordial one created. Some have speculated that Moryx may have been around pre-Tevat, either having a major and identified role or simply a more minor role, perhaps even simply a Vishap. After all, his main form does seem to be half-dragon. Again, this is all very up in the air, but at the very least we know that he is, quote, the most ancient of the 7. And if not the first to obtain a Gnosis, he obtained it rather early. He also did so exactly as Celestia intended, through blood. So even though he seems to have turned over a new leaf during his rule of Liyue, he could very well be judged the most harshly out of all the Archons. Nivelette's voice lines are interesting. Firstly, he calls him only by the name Deus Auri, or Golden God, and though the color gold is clearly associated with him as is Mora, it is not a title we have seen used for him before. This could be an actual title that might answer some of the secrets regarding him, or may just be referring to his elemental color and Mora creation. Nivelette then begins to placate the traveler, first saying that it will likely be a long while before he has to judge Deus Auri, and that it will not necessarily lead to a physical confrontation. I think Nivelette's response is very telling of how Mihoyo will handle the evilness of Zhongli. After all, Zhongli openly and readily admits to many previous mistakes and acknowledges that he would have made different choices based on what he knows now. So Zhongli having a dark past is already expected. Likewise, with all the hints relating to his age, it would not surprise many if he was a little older. Essentially, Mihoyo has set the expectation to be that Zhongli has a hidden and likely dark past on top of the dark past we already know, and likewise has already given him a redemption arc. So much like Nivelette assures us that Moryx will not be killed, so too is Mihoyo assuring the fans that Moryx's hidden stories will not end in his death and likely will be easily redeemed by acts we have already seen. Ai is an interesting case, as she is the successor of the original Electro Archon, though she reigned alongside her sister, if unbeknownst to others. Nivelette actually seems to be one of those who does not realize there was a change in power, as he refers to the Electro Archon as the Raiden and claims they took the authority of Electro. So either he's still operating under the belief that the Raiden Shogun never changed, or based on the fact that canonically Ai was the fighter of the two and often fought and defeated foes in her sister's name, it could be possible that Ai was the one to gain the Gnosis and passed it on to her sister, especially if, as Nivelette hints, it was taken, implying that it was won through fighting. Ergo, Raiden may have more of a price to pay. But again, much like Zhongli, Nivelette says he will visit her in a few more centuries as she seems to have distanced herself from the Gnosis and rule. So again, Mihoyo is letting us know not to worry so much. Nahida is also an interesting case, as though she is not Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, the Traveler should be the only one who knows that. Ergo, though Nahida herself should not really be judged harshly, she likely will answer for any crimes committed by Rukkhadevata as well. Which actually leads to an interesting point, as Apep says that Rukkhadevata once made a pact with dragons, though does not seem to imply sovereigns, so depending on the pact, it could work towards or against Buer's favor. That being said, Nivelette has one of the most flattering voice lines for Nahida, on par with his praise for Farina. He commends her on her responsibility and says he does feel regret that she was imprisoned for so many years, though he does still begin by saying he will judge her. I think this all comes back to how I mentioned that all our Archons are flawed, and that will likely be the greatest redeeming factor when it comes to their judgment. All of our Archons have a humanizing and thus sympathetic element. Nahida especially is one that many would find hard to see punished again, and Mihoyo knows this and are likely planning around it. If they play up that most of the Archons did not know the truth, or they had their own many ways of rebelling against Celestia, it is easy to see how they could all be judged and yet spared. Which leads us to Farina and Focalor, two halves of one whole. Well, she has been judged. Nivelette makes no mention of tracking Farina down. In fact, it very much appears as though everyone has taken the stance that the Hydro Archon is well and truly gone, and that Farina is not the Hydro Archon, and in a way, never was. Focalor readily gave up her gnosis to Nivelette and took herself out of the world, so perhaps without the dramatic sacrifice, that could also be the way the other Archons redeem themselves, by freely giving up their gnosis, which all of the 5 we've met, save Venti, have done. Which leads us to the last two. Moreta, we know virtually nothing about. Even Nivelette does not have voice lines for her. We knew more about the other Archons before we met them, and still know more about the Tsaritsa. So with that in mind, I do not think there is much of a point in speculating, especially if Genshin has been playing around with increasingly darker storylines. But knowing how much money the Archons make on banners, I would be surprised if they don't try to make her a fan favorite in some regard. That leaves the Tsaritsa, whom, as mentioned before, Fontaine technically owes. The question will be whether or not the handing over of the Gnosis was enough to clear this debt. At the very least, there is currently goodwill between the two nations, even if the debt is cleared. So what do we know about the Tsaritsa? Not a lot is confirmed. In fact, things are a little conflicting. It has long been rumored that Tsaritsa is the Archon of love. Dainsleif says she no longer has any love left for her people, nor her people for her, which completes Zhongli's statement of her no longer holding up the Archon value she once did. Scaramouche also uses love in her description. He refutes Dainsleif and says she is praised for her love and kindness. But people forget that love is also a sin. He goes on to imply she is compensating for a darker center. Tartaglia says she is actually very gentle, too gentle, which is why she had to harden herself. He says she only declared war against the world in an attempt to create peace. But here's the thing, Scaramouche is right. Many Christian sects from the ancient to modern day believe love to be a sin. In fact, there is an Ars Goetia demon who controls love. Not lust or any other evil quality, just love, Salos or Salios, which is most likely the Tsaritsa's Ars Goetia name. But why would love be a sin? After all, St. Peter described the best way of being a Christian was to love others as Christ had. How could a religion so praising of love also view it as a sin? Because the Lord must be loved above all else. This concept is seen most prominently with St. Augustine, a Christian philosopher from the 4th and 5th century, who often wrote on the dangers of love for others and love for the self being a concept that Plato had already attributed to sinning long before. Now, St. Augustine did not preach that we should be without love. Indeed, he believed that slothfulness was born of deficient love, but all other 6 deadly sins were born either of misdirected or excessive love. A lot of this makes sense. The self-love of pride would likely be deemed narcissism today. Envy, likewise, is born out of a hateful, misdirected love, not for a person, but for what they have, be it material or status. The central theme is simple to grasp. To live a life that is best suited for an Abrahamic believer, one must love God above all else, and regulate more earthly forms of love as they can quickly lead you astray. So how does that align with Genshin and the Tsaritsa? Quite easily, in fact. If we name Celestia / the Primordial One as the Genshin equivalent for the Demiurge or the Gnostic usurper who called himself God, then it is immediately apparent that yes, she is a sinner. She loves Teyvat and its people more than she loves Celestia, to the point where she seems intent to tear down the other Archons if it means gaining the means to destroy Celestia. But this is mostly speculation. After all, we do not know too much about her. Furthermore, characters describe her differently. After all, the Wanderer says her love is a sin, and Dainsleif accused her of having none for her people rather than just none for Celestia. and Tartaglia mentions gentleness but not love, which means we may have to play two truths and a lie with her descriptions. I will say that while some characters imply that Tartaglia has trouble reading people, he is the only native Sneznayan we know in detail, and most of the Fatui give us very minor lines about her if they mention her at all, so we'll be curious to see if Child is misreading her, or if he represents how native Sneznayans see their Archon. Now, what does this all mean for her Judgment Day? Well, it will likely end in one of two ways. If she does destroy Celestia, it could be seen as an action that will garner favor with Neuvillette, as it avenges the Sovereigns. Again, he did pass on the Gnosis to her without a care. On the other hand, the hoarding of the Gnoses could have the opposite effect and condemn her even more. Out of all the Archons, she has been played as the villain from day one, so she could still end with a villain's ending even if her cause is sympathetic. Just look at Signora, who, while definitely possessing an attitude problem, does have a very tragic backstory, and canonically, as of right now, she's very much dead. Well, I suppose this is a good point to transition into the recap portion of our video. Chapter 5. A recap on dragon classification, with a chart. Now, I do not want to go into too much detail with this part, as every dragon mentioned here I have already discussed in detail in my other dragon videos. Instead, I want to give a quick run through and provide a chart, as we are adding quite a lot of dragons of late, and Natlan is only going to give us more. So to make it easier, I'm going to try and sort them all into some basic categories. Now, this will need to be taken with a grain of salt, as some are easily confirmed and some are still up in the air. So let's begin with the Sovereigns. We have talked about Sovereigns extensively up till now, but if you skip to the end, the Sovereigns were the original dragons of Pritevat. They reigned before the Primordial One descended. As I mentioned in Chapter 1, their disposition was debatable for a while, but now it is clear that they were unfairly slaughtered. So our first Sovereign is Apep, whom we met in Nahida's character quest. Apep is corrupted by forbidden knowledge and a shell of the Dendro Sovereign they once were. Though they may not have their previous power, they are still a force to be reckoned with. And Nahida even spirals when thinking about what would happen if Apep were to be killed, because the elemental outpouring would likely destroy Teyvat. Apep clearly has a grudge against the usurper and has extended that onto humans as well. Apep is named after Apophis, an Egyptian deity that is also named Apep. This deity was a giant snake that was said to be the enemy of Ra, making it sometimes called the evil snake. Neuvillette makes up our second sovereign, as he has clearly revealed that he is the water sovereign, which, yes, unfortunately to aid in confusion, is also sometimes called the Hydro Dragon. Now, he was not the original Hydro Sovereign who reigned closer to present-day Inazuma, but he was reborn in Fontaine in accordance with a prophecy. Likewise, he is also said to be stuck in his human form, so while he is a sovereign, as Mihoyo has lovingly pointed out, according to their lore, looks hardly matter when determining what is and isn't a dragon. So for now, Neuvillette is stuck as a human, but perhaps, as he has regained his full authority, this may change in the future. Lastly, we have the Dragon King, or Nibelung, who we have not actually met in-game yet, but we do have a bit of backstory for. This Dragon King was the king of the sovereigns. We do not know if this means he was one of the 7 sovereigns or an 8th that reigned over them. Nibelung is likely the second throne, as Apep mentions Nibelung left Teyvat to attain dark knowledge and then came back. This was all done as a means of fighting back against the Primordial One, who waged war against the sovereigns. Nibelung comes from a Wagner opera, Der Ring des Nibelungen, or the Ring of the Nibelung. Nibelung is not a character, but rather a term used to describe the dwarves in the opera, which originated from the German and Norse terms for foreign rulers and their treasure, which might explain the ties Nibelung has to Conria. Speaking of, let's move on to our next category. Conrian created dragons. The Conrians created many mechanical and biological beasts, many of which fought against the nations of Teyvat. 2 of these beasts are called dragons in-game. The first is Durin, a Conrian dragon that fought against Mondstadt and Dvalin. Durin himself seems to imply that he thought the battle was a beautiful dance. He seems to not really understand the violence he was causing. He was slain by Dvalin, and his corpse can be found in dragon spines still corrupted to this day. Interestingly, he's said to be a homunculus, and Albedo is his sibling. His name is the name of a dwarf from the Norse Eddas, and it means sleepy. The next Conrian dragon is Elianas. We do not know exactly how Elianas came to be, as he existed in a void-like space before Mother found him. He was then taken to be with his siblings. Much like Durin, Elianas does not seem to at first understand that he is causing harm to the humans, and indeed expresses regret when he learns that he has been. Elianas has a region of Fontaine named after him, and his bones can be found there. His blood gave birth to the Melusines. Elianas came from the original myth about the Melusine and is the father of the Melusine in the myth. Up next, we have an oddly named category of real dragon, but not sovereign. Now, this is because there is some debate. They could simply be elemental beings that took the form of dragons, or they might even technically be sovereigns, just not clarified as such. Ajdaha is the one that is most up for debate. Ajdaha is a Geodragon and named Overlord of the Geovishaps. He is also older than Morax, which culminates the evidence that he might be a sovereign. But it was never confirmed, so I will leave him as definitely a dragon, but not confirmed as a sovereign. Ajdaha was once a close ally and friend of Morax before he eroded, and Morax was forced to seal him away. He escaped briefly once, but is now forever trapped within Jiyun Karst. Ajdaha is the name of an Iranian snake myth where snakes turn into evil dragons. The second real dragon, but not sovereign, is Dvalin. Dvalin is one of the four winds of Mondstadt and is just an elemental being that developed into the form of a dragon in the high heavens. He is one of the defenders of Mondstadt and only becomes corrupted after his battle with Durin. Dvalin also comes from the Norse Eddas and means the sleeping or dormant one. Now, I would have this be the last category, but the last one I will discuss will be speculative, so for now, unknown. I'm putting Morax here. I previously mentioned that Morax is not a real dragon at all, and that's true. Canonically, he's only half dragon. Again, we do not even know if he had one dragon parent or if he was born of the elements and simply formed an amalgamation of the two forms. But in light of the fact that Mihoyo keeps hinting that he has more secrets, and he was up until Neuvillette Genshin's most iconic dragon, and is still well loved by the fandom, so simply based on those two factors, I made him his own category of unknown, just in case we find out more later. On to our last category, sovereign descendants. So to start with, any Vishap qualifies. We are expressly told that Vishaps are the children of sovereigns, so both the Geovishaps and Bathysimal Vishaps count, which of course includes the Primo Geovishap as well. The name Vishap comes from the Armenian dragon legends about a dragon that lives on Mount Ararat. And finally, Netlands dragons. I am going to speculate that Netlands dragons are sovereign descendants. As Neuvillette says, they are not like him, they evolved differently, which could mean they were one of the elements like Dvalin, but to me seem to suggest that they were originally some sort of Vishap that evolved over the years. I have been exploring Netlands origins and with it dragon inspirations over on TikTok and will soon do a YouTube video that explores the outside speculative lore in depth. So let's take one last look at the chart, fully assembled. Chapter 6, the completed chart. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. I do plan on releasing more content. I'm just adjusting schedules at the moment, so please bear with me. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I truly do appreciate everyone that does. If you would like to add feedback or theories in the comments, I will gladly read it. So thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, or night. All the best.